Welcome to the Boston Art Podcast,
Boston's premier art podcast,
where we talk art, culture, and philosophy.
My name is Theodore Earthworms.
And I am Brian Huntress.
Welcome to the show. Hey guys, Theo and Brian here to provide some quick context for the upcoming episode. What you're about to listen to is the fifth segment in the 7-part interview series we recorded this fall about an exhibition that's currently on view at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston.
The exhibition is titled Touching Roots, Black Ancestral Legacies in the Americas, and it is located on the 3rd floor of the Art of the Americas wing in the MFA. This exhibition is included with general admission, so there is no extra cost to see it, and we highly recommend you check it out.
This week's installment is with Boston artist Stephen Hamilton. According to Stephen's website, his work incorporates both Western and African techniques, blending figurative painting and drawing with resist dyeing, weaving, and wood carving. Each image is a marriage between the aesthetic perspectives and artistry of both traditions. This forms a body of work which serves as a conceptual and visual bridge between the ancient and modern worlds. Through this, he explores elements of Black identity through time and space on its own terms.
We were able to talk to 7 of the curators and artists involved in this exhibition, and for the sake of clarity, we are going to release these in chronological order, so you can learn with us. Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy the show.
That was very good.
You're cool with that?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
No problem. So my name is Stephen Hamilton. I am a artist, educator, researcher from Boston, Massachusetts. My work focuses mainly on the art and art history of pre-colonial Western West Central Africa, and more broadly, the cultural connections that exist between that period in history and the African diaspora. I'm, in addition to being a painter and illustrator, I'm also a traditional artist, so I am a weaver and wood carver. I learned weaving and wood carving at the Nikkei Center for Art and Culture in Nigeria. I have the opportunity to travel there by way of artist residency, international artist residency put on by Arts Connect International, which is an organization based in Boston. A lot of the work that I do in terms of my research focuses on textile art. So the histories of textiles, of handmade textiles, and affiliated industries such as, spinning, dyeing. I'm also a natural dyer. So a lot of my work is sort of like experimenting with things that I learned through my research. And then the artwork becomes a way in which I can share these different types of research with my audience.
Amazing. I feel like I have so many questions based on the things that you just said. There's a lot there. If we could start from the beginning, maybe we could talk about how you first got into art and kind of explore that trajectory and how it happened for you.
Okay, so it's really hard to sort of pinpoint.
Yeah.
When my interest in art started, there's a lot of different entryways, so...
Yeah, I mean, so many of us are, drawing from the time we're kids, or maybe we had a parent or a guardian that was like an artist.
So I think for me, there's 2 main sort of influences in terms of like me starting like my interest or my journey in art making. One is that I grew up in Roxbury. It's a neighborhood in Boston that has a long history of like public art. Mm-hmm. So I grew up seeing murals like painted in my neighborhood. I often talk about like memories of going to Nubian Notion with my mother. Nubian Notion was a store that sold a lot of different goods. They sold greeting cards, clothes. They sold a lot of products from the African continent in the former Dudley Square, now Nubian Square. And I remember that they would also sell prints from artists, not only from Boston, but just like Black artists in general that were working in the 90s. And some artists who were from Boston. So I remember seeing Paul Goodnight's work not only in like murals and public art, but seeing like his prints for sale there. So I remember like going there, she would like buy greeting cards or like different things, and I would like flip through the book of prints and see all the work that was there. I also, like a lot of kids, was super into cartoons. So I remember like watching Saturday morning cartoons, watching X-Men, watching Spider-Man, watching all of those things, and that sort of like bringing my interest into like comics and comic book art, like sort of first full circle, and sort of like being really inspired and interested in that, and like drawing those characters as well. And like through both of those things, being really interested in like storytelling and visual storytelling. So I credit those two things as two of like my main like sort of forays into like my interest in art. So one is like more typical for a lot of like boys growing up in the early 90s, and the other one is also a very typical story for a lot of artists who grew up in Roxbury, surrounded by the sort of like really beautiful public art that was being created specifically for people in that community by people who were living in that community. You know, so thinking about artists like Dana Chandler and, you know, Paul Goodnight and Gary Rickson, who were like sort of creating like these really beautiful murals. Sharon Dunn is another artist who's like creating all these really beautiful murals in Roxbury in the South End.
Yeah.
It's sort of like growing up and seeing that all the time and sort of being inspired by those images.
That's really cool. I love hearing you talk about being surrounded by this art and culture in Boston specifically. I think it's really fun to kind of explore that and think about somebody who grew up around all of this from a really young age versus having this kind of pivotal moment where you kind of decided. It's always kind of been fed to you. That's really neat to hear that in your
You
story.
also said that it was kind of unusual for you in the early 90s to be like getting into like art and stuff. Like, I'm curious about what was your, like, what kind of kid were you in terms of like, you know, did you have a lot of friends that were like trying to learn about like art and things of this nature? Were you kind of an odd one out?
No, I mean, it was pretty typical. So like,
Okay.
If you're looking at a lot of kids who like to draw, like they're drawing, you know, Dragon Ball Z.
Right, for sure. Anime.
And I was one of those kids.
Hell yeah.
They're drawing like X-Men characters, they're drawing Spider-Man, they're doing all of that type of stuff. And I was also one of those kids. So I brought that up to say that I also had the, you know, typical story. But I guess in a way, like looking at public art in Boston, that's also part of the typical story. Like if you look at a lot of amazing Boston-based muralists and graffiti artists, they're also growing up during that period of time. And even though I wasn't necessarily a part of that world, you know, you do see like that influence of like these like sort of legends who are doing this mural work, and also growing up and seeing that and seeing like people who are like invested in their community and sharing art in their community in that way. So I think for artists in Boston, and I think sometimes artists who are from other cities who also grew up seeing that mural tradition that's like very much affiliated with like the Black arts movement, like in the late 60s and 70s, that's a point of inspiration for a lot of us.
You know, and I feel stupid right now because I actually was not aware of the deep and rich history of murals, like in the city of Boston.
Yeah.
Is this something, like, how did you come to learn about all these artists? Was it just you grew up with them and then you just needed to know the origins and where they came from?
So I first grew up with the art. That was the big thing.
Sure.
And then for certain artists, they're just like very just present in the community. So when I'm thinking about like artists like Paul Goodnight and like other, like all of these artists are like very present in the community. So if you have family members and you're from Boston and you've like lived here for a certain amount of time, like your paths will cross with them. Too is that like you know, there was just like a sort of like very welcoming like attitude with a lot of these artists. So like I would go and I would visit these places and I would visit like their studios like when I was an adult, like, or a young adult, college, and people were very open. Like I remember going to open studios and talking to Equa Holmes too. Like Sharon Dunn was actually my teacher in college. She was my drawing teacher at Mass Art. So there was like also a sense of accessibility with a lot of people here, which I also think is really fortunate. So, you know, I think when I was really, really young, I didn't know who they were. I knew about their artwork, but I think, you know, as I got older and I got more serious as an artist, like going to open studios at Amart You know, at the Piano Factory, I was able to sort of get to know a lot of these sort of older artists. And then also like the artist community in Boston is really small.
Mm-hmm.
So you just get connected with so many people, and so many of us are like sort of connected with each other. Like we either work together at some point, or we've seen each other at shows. Like because it's such a close-knit community, a lot of us like have crossed paths with each other and had opportunities to have conversations with each other, and have like sort of built like mentor-mentee relationships. You know, and like I could talk about that for hours, but
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's really fascinating and something really interesting when I think about like sort of like the artist space that I grew up in and the artist space I'm in now.
yeah, we'd love to touch on the mentor subject in a little bit, but first, I was these you mentioned A-Mart Studios and the Piano Factories. Are those artist communities that are still there?
So it's hard for me to say that. You're probably going to get me tripping over my words. I'm not really completely sure myself on the status of
You'd probably know more than we do.
I do know that the Piano Factory Gallery is still active. I know that there are some artists that are still at the Piano Factory, and not as many.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what the status of A-Mart is right now because I haven't been there in a while. I know
For sure.
Jersey, and there was a lot of like issues in terms of like artists having access to the space and like issues with the lease, but I don't want to really speak on that because I don't know what the status of that is right now.
Oh yeah, you got that. And yeah, because like in terms of being a younger artist and like being like I definitely have a lot of memories of like, you know, in the town that I grew up in, there was this, you know, old factory building and filled with art studios and stuff, and I would just go in and just walk around in the building and just look at people's art on the walls and in the hallways and stuff. And I remember it being I remember just being in awe that like you could just be in a little room or workshop in a big building and just be toiling away and making stuff. Like it was definitely a very foreign idea to me. So to see that as a young person is huge. You mentioned mentor-mentee relationships with older artists in your community. Could you talk about some of those that you had?
I think, I mean, it's really complicated because like I wouldn't say that I had like any sort of like fixed mentor, but like I do remember like having conversations with people about my art and showing them my artwork, and them giving really honest feedback, and people recommending me for things, people writing me letters of recommendation for things, and just the immense amount of support that I got like from that community of folks. And I think that was something that was very, very helpful. And it was really interesting to see, like I said, how that crossed over in so many different ways. Like some of these people were professors that I had in school. So like, you know, you had artists that were like living and working in Boston, that were also working at Mass Art, that I worked with at Mass Art and built relationships with at Mass Art. Or like artists that I just walked into their studios and had conversations with. And would just always like check in with them every time there was open studios.
Yeah.
And there was just like so many different layers with that. And it's really interesting how that crosses over. Like I had friends who were at Boston Arts Academy. I didn't go to Boston Arts Academy, but I had friends that went to Boston Arts Academy, and just like the relationship that they've had with teachers that were there, like have continued all throughout the years. And like, you know, I worked at Artists for Humanity, and there's so many amazing artists that like were working out of there, and like those mentor relationships that like sustained. I also was a mentor at Artists for Humanity for a while, so I also like have built like mentor relationships with students.
Oh, that's really cool. I know some people that were part of the teen program there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
When were they part of the teen program there?
It was a few years ago. I'd say it was probably 2019.
Oh, 2019. That was after my time. I was a mentor there from 2010 to 2015.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I was there for from 2010 to 2015, and I was in the paint studio.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
That seems like a really cool program. I know they have, from what I knew of it, they have teenagers come and they paint and they can sell their work and they get paid a wage too.
Yeah. What was really awesome about it was that there were like amazing mentors there, like an incredible artist that I looked up to a lot, like Rob Gibbs, Hanar Ortega worked there for a while. Friends of mine, you know, that I was friends with, like, before I started working there when I was in high school, I wasn't part of the program as a teen.
Yeah.
You know, uh, there's so much, there's so many, like, amazing people, you know, that were there and are still, like, working as part of the program. Jason Talbot, like, there's like so many people that I met when I was there, and they're also connected to so many friends of mine who were young people who grew up in the program who are working as artists now.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and again, those people, some of those people who were there were also, you know, friends that I met at Mass Art, and friends that, like, I had met while I was in high school. I didn't go to Boston Arts Academy, I went to Fenway, but people that I knew that went to Boston Arts Academy. You know, so there's, like, really interesting ways in which, like, all of these different spaces, like, sort of like fostered community in that interesting way, and they're all connected in these really fascinating ways.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful and important thing too, because I feel like sometimes there are some artists I feel like that work in a very solitary way where they don't get as much input from other people or don't share ideas with other people. And I know that works for some, but I feel like there's so much richness that you can get from being part of an arts community, both in feeding your own soul and from connecting with other people and teaching and things like that. Could we talk a little bit too about you mentioned that you were a student at Mass Art, and you're also a teacher. Do you teach at Mass Art?
I taught at Mass Art in the illustration department for some time. Before I went to Nigeria, I taught as an adjunct professor in illustration. When I got back, I worked as an adjunct professor for a little while, and then I was a assistant professor. Not assistant professor. I was a Tempo 1, so I think that's like an associate professor in illustration. I also worked in I also worked in Studio Foundation there, so I was working mostly with freshmen and sophomores. I left in 2000. I left in 2020. I left in 2020 because I started my PhD at Harvard in 2021. So I'm a second year PhD student. I'm a G2 in the AAAS program, the African and African American Studies program at Harvard. And I'm currently teaching at Boston College, but I'm teaching African art and visual culture at Boston College. So I'm teaching a more academic course now. But most of my background in terms of teaching college students, also teaching high school students, because again, I was a mentor at Artistry Humanity, and I was also an instructor at Art a la carte, which was a college preparatory class at College Bound Dorchester. But most of my teaching experience has been with being an art instructor. So this is my first time teaching an academic course.
That is legendary. It seems like that is like quite the list of accomplishments. I'm curious too to kind of bring it back a little bit, talking about, you know, being a young person and drawing Dragon Ball Z and running around with the sketchbook and meeting older artists, all the way up to this, like, you know, frankly ridiculously accomplished young artist. You know, like how did, like, I'm curious as to how you became, or how you went from a kid fascinated with art and color and all of this, and to being, you know, like an accomplished academic. Like, how could, like, if we could go back to like freshman year or for your first year of college, like what was, like, you know, your attitude like, or your intentions, or what kind of student were you in the beginning?
So I was always really interested in the history of the African continent. That's something that I remember from the time that I was, like, before I was in high school. I remember being in middle school, being really fascinated by the history of the African continent. I was excited whenever I had the opportunity to do social studies or history projects, and we had the option to choose, because I would always choose something about the history of the African continent. It was something that I was interested in all throughout high school. My high school program My high school capstone project was on the fall of the Benin Kingdom and the sack of the Benin Kingdom in 1897. I was like really interested in all of these things because, again, what really interests me about these really fun things growing up, like watching cartoons and even looking at the murals, was the world building and the storytelling, and thinking about what does it look like to create worlds, what does it look like to build worlds, and what does it look like to enthrall people in a story. And when I was thinking about stories that related to me, stories that related to Black people, I was really interested in like the ancient history of the African continent, because it allows you space to imagine so many more possibilities, outside of like these really deeply problematic racial paradigms that we have to deal with in the 20th century. So thinking about history, thinking about what does it look like to reconstruct and rebuild and like sort of like create or play around in these like sort of worlds, was something that was really fascinating to me. And as I got older, and as I learned more about the history, and I learned more about all of the complexities and nuance that exist in African history, it really helped me understand a lot more about the cultural experiences that I have now and the cultural experience I share with people in the African diaspora in the present world. So I think, all of that has been a through line since I was really young. And even when I was at Mass Art, even when I was in the illustration department, so much of my work focused on that, to the point where my reference material wasn't just photos that I took or observational drawings. It was really reading. So research was a huge part of a lot of the work that I did. And that research practice continued to be a part of my artistic praxis. So like reading academic papers, reading books, having conversations. We didn't have an African art history course at Mass Art when I was there. We had a teacher who was an awesome teacher named Peg Turner, who taught Art of the Americas. And she would also teach African art history, but she had since not taught that class. So I would have conversations with her. She actually gave me, when I was teaching there, she gave me like a ton of books, like a huge box of books.
Oh, wow.
I like loved the subject matter, but like that was always a part of my art making. Reading and research was always such a huge part of my art making, that the transition into moving into like an academic space wasn't as much. The biggest transition is like, okay, instead of this being a painting, this is now a paper. So when I think about like being a kid and I think about being an adult, that was still something that was very present. Also, the murals that I was looking at were all about that. They were all about these Black artists who were looking at Africa and looking at the African past, and trying to empower and inspire, Black people in those communities, Black and brown people in those communities, to really think about worlds that exist beyond present circumstance. So being able to like understand that there is a past that stretches back before all of this, and there's a future that stretches beyond all of this. And that's something that stuck with me a lot. It's something that sticks with me now. So like, when I'm thinking about like the trajectory, it's sort of like building on like a fascination that I've had for a very long time.
Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful thinking about like, because, actually, to rephrase my question, if I could actually ask about a few specific works you made on your website, you have a tab called the 3 icons, and there are these three absolutely gorgeous dynamic paintings. One thing I noticed that's a really interesting theme in them is that they are these figurative works mixed, these realistic figurative works mixed in with almost still life depictions of I think you would call them statues or things of that nature. Could you describe, I guess, the relationship between, it looks like, the illustration and portraiture in these works and the figures featured around them?
So that series of works, the three icons, I do these. Most of my work is most of my pieces are like these textile assemblages that I paint on. They're these wood textile assemblages that I paint on. So I'll weave or do resist dyeing on fabric, and then I'll paint on top of it. But usually what I'll do is I'll do studies, like these mixed media studies. So I wanted to do like these larger, just like mixed media studies that might lend themselves to future work. So like thinking about murals, thinking about like large scale paintings. The name Three Icons is like exploring three common icons in West and West Central African artwork, and that's of the mother, the horseman, and the caryatid figure, or the votary maid. These are images that pop up a lot across the African continent, especially in West and West Central Africa. And sort of what I wanted to do is I wanted to think about how I plant my contemporary work in art history, and thinking about how I'm referencing these icons and how I'm referencing the symbolism in my work. So the one of the woman who's nursing a child and holding a knife, its name is Shia's Love and Wrath, is exploring the idea of the Divine Mother in many West and West Central African cultures, which is also sort of analogy for, the feminine forces of the universe, the earth, and sort of this dual creative and destructive nature that has like a feminine coding to them in a lot of West and West Central African spiritual traditions, amongst the Yoruba, amongst the Igbo, amongst certain Mande groups. This image of the mother as analogous with earth, the earth which provides, the earth which nurtures, the earth which also eats you in death. So propensity for creation and destruction, and sort of this symbol for the power of women as the upholders of society through creation, but also thinking about these associations with like wealth and abundance, but also the propensity for wrath and destruction. And thinking about like all of these symbols which are meant to appease not only the Earth Mother, but to appease these sort of figurative divine mothers. So the sculptures that you're seeing there are images of these mother and child figures that exist throughout West and West Central Africa. So they're images that are Yoruba, that are Congo, that are Igbo. There's like an image there that's from a very ancient rock painting from Cecilia Niger. This ancient rock painting from Cecilia Niger in Algeria, which is one of the earliest images of a mother nursing a child.
Oh, wow.
Thinking about the other figure, the piece Aruba. The Aruba is the votary maid. The Aruba carries the offering to the Orisha in Yoruba religious practices. But also thinking about that as like she who holds like sacred force, she who's containing like sacred force, who's giving the offering, and thinking about like how that form is present in Yoruba art, it's present in Igbo art, certain Ewe and Akan traditions. That iconography is also present in ancient artistic traditions like the knot culture. You see like these male and female figures like encircled, like holding up objects, but also thinking about this idea of offering and sort of like these lush like images of like these very beautiful like offerings which are given to the deities. When you see festivals in Nigeria, Orisha festivals, you'll see these priestesses holding these beautiful carvings and statues and offering bowls and, balancing them on their head. and moving in procession to shrines. And it's just such a striking image that's present in a lot of cultures across West and West Central Africa. And the last one, which is called A Thousand Hooves, which is also the name of the mural that I did in a Nubian Square that was sponsored by Black Market Nubian and Street Theory, and facilitated by Street Theory Gallery. That drawing is an ode to the African horseman. So, like, the image of the horseman is a prominent symbol of, like, war and conquest in West Africa. Like, the symbol of the horse and the mounted rider is very important. It has religious significance too. Like, the analogy of, like, riding a horse is also associated with being mounted by the spirit. So what some people might call spirit possession. There's also analogies that exist there. But it's a very common icon. And I was really interested in thinking about, like, how these icons sort of exist in all of these different African cultures, and sort of creating this body of work, these, like, 3 pieces, which are heavily referencing that, which is something that's important to me in my work, is how am I referencing African art history and African art historical traditions, and also, like, looking at the visual language and worldview of these cultures, while I'm making statements about not only the ancient African world, but present-day Black experiences.
And speaking of present-day Black experiences and relating to the art, Martina Tanga, one of the other curators, told us that about your piece. I believe it is it's Deshaun depicted as Mansa Musa. I might have got that title wrong.
Mansa Musa's probably great uncle.
Oh, okay.
Sunjata Keita was the founder of the Mali Empire. So Mansa Musa was a later king. He was one of his nephews, I believe.
Oh, understood. Yeah. She mentioned about that piece that you were depicting or using, I guess, people you know in real life as the models for these paintings. I guess, like, is that?
Yeah.
Oh, I guess I was just gonna ask: is that something you're doing in a I'm losing my in a symbolic way, because a lot of people are using models in a utilitarian sense, but it seems like with the way that you're depicting these people, like, do you feel like that's a way of connecting, history to the present by using these real people that you know?
Yes, and, like, the that was part of the Founders Project. So the Founders Project was working with high school students from Boston. And some of these were students that I had worked with and I had built relations with prior, and some of them were people I just met. But they all went through an interview process, and most of what the interview process was, it wasn't like, oh, you're in, you're not. It was just, like, getting to know them and getting to know, like, how, really thinking about, like, how they see themselves and how they want other people to see them. And then through those conversations, like, creating these works, which are using them as the models for these different historical figures in pre-colonial African history. And the last body of work that I was doing, that was a more intensive project. I did a photo project collaborating with my cousin Stacey Hamilton, who's a photographer. And we did an interview process with people, and then they were dressed in, like, clothing and items that I made, and did a photo series based off of that. And then I did a series of paintings based off of that photo series. But it was heavily based off of, like, thinking about how people see themselves and want to be seen, and thinking about how that can pair with certain, like, certain iconography or images or, like, ideas or personages related to pre-colonial Africa. So looking at African iconography and imagery and thinking about, like, how people see themselves and want other people to see them, and sort of, like, basing the images off of merging both of those two things. And the idea behind it was, like, really thinking about, like, how do people have agency and representation, even when you're painting them. So, like, thinking about, like, sort of the weird ethics around painting people or photographing people.
Right.
And thinking about, like, how people have agency in those depictions and those representations. So that was like a big thing for me with those two projects. And that's something just moving forward that I think about. Like, it wasn't always things that I thought about, but like I think about it more and more.
Yeah.
Like as I get older, I think about it more and more. Like as I continue to work doing figurative painting. But yeah, that was a big part of that piece that's up at the MFA now. Like really thinking about like those issues of representation, also because Deshaun was a student of mine, was somebody that I had worked with. But yeah, that is something that comes up a lot for me, like as a person who paints other people.
Could you tell us a little bit about the symbolism in this piece specifically?
So the Epic of Sanjata is one of my favorite stories. Is going mostly off the D.T. Nyani translation. So Sanjata Keita was the founder of the Mali Empire. He is called the son of the lion and the buffalo. His real name is Marijata, which means lion prince. The name Sanjata is a contraction of his mother's name, Sogolon, and the word Jata meaning prince. But he's referred to as the son of the lion and the buffalo. So the lion represents his father's clan, Naremaga the Handsome, who's claimed to be descended from the first muezzin of the Prophet Muhammad. So through his father and through the legends, in his through the legends surrounding his father's lineage, he's traced back to one of the to the Prophet Muhammad, because you're tracing to Bilal ibn Rabah. You're creating a connection with the Muslim world, which was a big thing for a lot of royal families back in the day, specifically royal Islamic families back in the day. But through his mother, he's descended from, the masters of fire. His mother was like the wraith of the buffalo spirit, which connects him to like this sort of like really ancient, because he's Mandinga, this really ancient Mandinga Mande spiritual tradition and magical tradition. So those images are prominent there. So you see the buffalo and the lion as sort of like references to that lineage. And also you see like an element of throughout the story, like the traces of matrilineage and the traces of like matriarchy there, because he's always reminded, remember, Siddhartha, you are not just the son of the lion, you are also the son of the buffalo. So the son of your mother and your mother's people and your mother's tradition. So those symbols are there. And then thinking about the iconography of him with the iron bow. So the story is that Sanjata was born disabled. He couldn't walk well into like early childhood, and his body was insanely heavy. And his mother would be chastised constantly for having a child who couldn't walk, because it was prophesied that he would become the greatest conqueror since Alexander. Again, you see references from the Islamic world that filter their way into the story later on, because Alexander the Great has like a huge presence in like Islamic lore, mythology, because of like his presence in like Western Asia. But that he'd become this great conqueror, that he'd become like the lion prince. So they would pretty much insult her. So after seeing his mother weep, he asked to be brought a stick, and they brought him like a stick, and it broke under his weight. So then he asked for an iron bar, and the iron bar bent under his weight, and from that bar became his bow.
Oh, wow.
And then when he rose himself up, he tore up a baobab sapling. So people use baobab for different things. They use the fruit has like a lot of nutritional value, but also the leaves are used in soup. So he went to the central courtyard and he pulled up the baobab sapling and he put it at his mother's feet as an offering. So all the women who insulted her would then have to go to her to get their leaves.
Oh, wow.
So all of the imagery of the story, the baobab leaves behind him, the iron bow, the lion and the buffalo, the hunter's tunic, which also connects him to the mysteries of the bush and the hunters, and all of this very complex, like syncretized, like imagery that's there, because like during this period of time, it's like during the early like coming of Islam into that part of West Africa. So you see these Islamic references and this entrance to the Islamic world, with also this connection with a very ancient Mande civilization. Mande civilization predates the coming of Islam in West Africa by thousands of years. So you see like all of these references into this deep, like ancient lore of this area around the Niger River, along with like this syncretization with like the coming of Islam in the Islamic world. I mean, those were all like sort of references that I'm making, because even the frames are referencing like the sort of embossed metal latching and decoration that you'll see on like mosques and madrasas that would come up later on after the reign of Keita, after like the establishment of the Mali Empire and the sort of like building of these like Islamic centers of learning that became possible after Sunjata Keita, because he created stability in that region after the fall of the Ghana Empire. So there's like all these really like layered like historical references that are like sort of happening in the piece, referencing the story and also referencing like the things that happened after the story.
And the fabric at the top, is that an example of Adiri art technique?
Yeah, so that's Adire. So that in Mande they would call it Gara. So Adire is the Yoruba term. So Sunjata's people will call it Gara or some version of Gara. Yeah, and it's like an example. Like all the pieces in that series has Adire on the top. And then the piece itself is painted on strip woven cloth. That one, most of those, most of the hand woven fabric that I used for that, was I actually had to buy. So some of the hand woven fabric was woven in Nigeria. So I had dyed the fibers and I had woven pieces with weavers in Nigeria.
Wow.
And I brought them back. And then other pieces were pieces that I had purchased, strip woven pieces that were made in either Gambia or Mali that I had purchased and that I had dyed myself. Yeah, so that's the case with that one. So I didn't do the weaving on that piece, but I did the weaving on some pieces, and some of the other pieces in the series were also woven by my students. So that was like very complex, and there's a very complicated story on why that piece had to be made that way. It was like a sort of a tragic story. Like I had woven the background for another piece, and it was stolen. The cloth that I woven was stolen, and I had to use the cloth that was originally meant for that work for another piece, and then I had to use a piece because I didn't want to use too much from the cloth that I had brought back from Nigeria, but I ended up having to use that to finish the piece.
Oh wow!
How do you find painting on the woven fabric? Is it a similar experience to painting on canvas?
Yeah, it's very similar to painting on like a very coarse canvas. Some of the pieces that I do, like in the last series that I did, those pieces were all woven by me.
Wow.
Those, yeah, I did all of the weaving and dyeing. One piece was dyed by a student of mine, and it was originally meant for one of the Founders Project pieces, but I ended up using it for one of the pieces of my last series. But some of them can be very, very like heavy or coarse, and they can have like a really intense texture, especially the weft flow patterns that are on them. But once they're primed, they're actually really easy to paint on. And some of the pieces that I thought I would have a lot of issues painting on, I did not have as many issues painting on. It wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. The muslin is very easy to paint on. Some of the pieces, so you'll notice in some of the work, you have muslin that's been dyed that's sewn to like hand woven pieces, so you'll see a shift in the texture. The muslin is really, really easy to paint on because it creates a very smooth surface. So like there's like differences in the way that the paint sort of sits on the fabric, but I don't have too much of a challenge doing it. When I was in school and I was a broke college student, I would paint on like really gnarly pieces of wood. Like,
Sure.
Yeah, it's not too difficult.
Right, you're seasoned to paint.
Yeah.
Right.
What I can't paint on though, because the thing is when you have like oil paint, it can degrade like wood and fiber, so it has to be primed a certain way.
Right.
And if I add too much the gel medium on the fabric, it will sort of like cloud or obscure the dyes.
Oh, gotcha.
So I use acrylic because like I can't over prime the surface, and if I used oil, it would break down the fabric.
Right, and it would be such a shame to disguise like the beautiful, you know, textures and story happening in the weavings and fabric.
I have a question too, just to circle back just a little bit. I don't know if this is something that's personal between you and the model, but would you be able to talk about the reason that you chose Deshawn for this piece? I know you said there was an interview process and you really spoke to each person to choose.
I chose Deshawn because Deshawn is a natural leader. And he has the energy that I could see Deshawn like really. I could see if you need to rally people to do something, I would get Deshawn to do it. I would get Deshawn to talk. He could get people to do things. I really do. He's not as serious as a personality as like they depict Sunjata as, but I do see him as somebody who I would imagine being a leader.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reason why I picked him.
Has he seen the piece?
Yeah, he's seen it.
Did he like it? I feel like that would have been so exciting.
He liked the piece. And the thing about it, which is so cool, is like seeing students like respond really well to the paintings. I was like nervous, like, oh, they're gonna feel weird putting on these clothes and photographing them. They loved it. They loved on the clothes. They loved like the photography process. One of the students who did a piece that was collected by the ICA, like I painted her on that piece. Her name's Janae Wyatt, and she's actually a really talented artist. She's finishing up her last year at Leslie, and you know, just seeing her like share the piece and like conversations that she's has about like stuff in museum collections, and you know, just also thinking about the fact that her and some of the other people that I painted are artists.
Yeah.
So a lot of these young people are painters themselves who do like amazing work. Some of them aren't. Some of them, Deshawn's a musician. But like it's like really interesting to see like people respond very well to that experience, but also like knowing the fact that I was documenting young people, and some of these young people that I was documenting that I was painting are creators themselves. Like these are images of, you know, people who are like this next generation of artists, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, with as yet unknown futures.
Yeah.
It must be so like amazing too to like for like I mean I like to try to put myself in the shoes of a you know like a high school student or you know a young person working with someone like you and like you know with like such an accomplished academic background and doing this project, and then the picture of them is in the MFA. Like that must have been like such a trip. Like it must have profound probably.
The whole thing is like I've worked with high school students for a long time. I've like done things with like young people for a long time. I guess my whole thing is like I just wanted to make sure that people felt like my intentions were sincere, and that like people felt a sense of comfort, and that like they had an enjoyable experience, and that like I had like their best interests at heart when doing the work. You know, I think that was the biggest thing for me, because that's the thing. Anybody who works with young people, lets you know it's like you got to come in with sincerity, because kids will smell bullshit a mile away.
For sure.
Yeah.
You gotta you have to really think about ways in which you build like a sense of honesty and trust. And that's I think that what I'm hoping is that that's what they felt from me, and that's why they had that sense of comfort with me and my cousin photographing them, with me and Stacey photographing them and being part of the project.
Yeah. Wow, that is so cool. That sounds like such an immersive experience too. How long did it take to do this series, and is it still in progress?
To do the Founders Project, it was a year's worth of work. I did the Founders Project through the Now and There Public Art Accelerator.
Okay.
Which does it's like these temporary art installations around the city, and they've sponsored like amazing work from like amazing artists from around the city. But I was working on it from January to November 2018. I had an amazing team of young people that was working with me, because in addition to the models, I had people who I had taught weaving and dyeing with another project that I did the year before. I was able to hire 5 of them to work on the project with me, helping me with the weaving and the dyeing. I also hired another artist who wasn't a student that I taught, but I had met at Mass Art, who was like an amazing weaver. And they were helping me with the weaving and the dyeing and like some of the finishing, and I was doing all of the wood carving and the painting, and also some of the weaving, because it was just like so much of the weaving that had to be done. But we got it done by October 31st. A lot of sleepless nights, but we made it happen. And it's like an amazing team of young artists. All of them are talented young artists. Some of them, all of them are working as artists now. Tatiana and Adriana DeLise, who are young people that I taught at Artist for Humanity. Tony Perez, who's an amazing illustrator and fine artist, who's also, I believe, college professor now. Jordan Nelson, Louis Arena, who's like does like custom sneakers. These are people I've worked with since they were like 16.
Yeah.
And Alexander Hartanto, who's an artist working out of Indonesia, who was a student at Mass Art, who Tony connected me to also help with some of the weaving. And he's an Indonesian artist who specializes in like weaving and dyeing traditions that are from Indonesia. So it was like really awesome also having conversations with him and working with him through that project. But it was a very small team of people, and we were able to get that done in like a very short amount of time. And also because of like the nature of the work, and because I also want to respect people's time and labor, it was also difficult because like all of the painting and carving, all of those parts like I was doing personally.
Yeah.
And like a lot of the weaving and dyeing I was also doing personally too. But like I'm very happy from the support and the work that they did on that project, because I wouldn't have been able to finish that without them.
That is so crazy. Even just like the blending and the detail in the paintings, the fact that it happened in that time frame is so impressive, even with the team.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was a lot. Like one thing about working at Artists for Humanity that I appreciated is you learn how to work. You learn how to work on a tight schedule. You learn how to you figure it out.
Yeah.
I asked this next question as like an introverted person, but I feel like there's like a lot of like, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like it can be a kind of artist stereotype to be like very solitary and like doing your own thing and lost in thought or whatever. Like, and I kind of feel like I might be kind of like that because I'm very introverted. But I know like one theme that I'm seeing through like a thread through all these stories you're telling us is there seems to be so much group collaboration in what you do, and so much like I don't know if community involvement would be the right word, but I really admire that. I'm kind of wondering where you found that, or if that's like something that's always come naturally to you working in a group, or leading projects, you know, like is that something you had to learn how to do, or have you always been that way?
Okay, I'm gonna be 100% honest with you. I am just as introverted. So introverted. Like I tell people, like, this sort of like outgoing personality that you see me with, like in the classroom or like doing these projects or talking in front of crowds, that is a lie that I put on to So I also have like crippling social anxiety. It's like really, really bad. This is just me.
I feel that.
I to be that honest because I never want people to think, you know, when they see it happening, that it's me behaving negatively towards them. It is very difficult for me to be in spaces like that. I think what has helped me is just sort of understanding that the work that I want to do it requires me to function in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, doing that type of work requires me to be able to like work with different people and be able to like sort of like motivate and organize different folks to work collaboratively with people to problem solve, to be able to, you know, sort of really be self-reflective, and sort of figure out like when is it appropriate for me to step up and also when to step back. Understanding like how to delegate, which is also something which is very difficult for me, but also understanding that in order for me to do the work ethically, there are certain things that I just have to do. Like I can't have an issue with like the agency that Black people have over their image and their bodies and not be inclusive in my painting practice and painting actual people in the way that I'm doing it. Like the way that I'm doing that is the way that I feel like is the way I can ethically apply like those concerns in my actual practice. You know, so, you know, I have to sort of like push through that in ways that I'm able to. And, you know, there are times where like I can do it and then sometimes I can't. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm always like able to.
Right.
But like I think that I'm beginning to figure out when I can do that and when I can't. And it's something that I'm still trying to figure out. It's something that I'm really still trying to figure out, especially as I'm thinking about what my practice as an educator is going to be moving forward. Because that's sort of the big thing. If you are getting a PhD, a lot of times the impetus is teaching, which is actually what I want to do and continue to do. But I also want to really think about like, what does that look like for me?
Yeah.
And what does that look like outside of sort of the ivory tower? And in order to do that, I have to be around people, which is not always my favorite thing to do. Even though I love people, it is I'm very much drained in situations like that at times. So I just want to speak, like you're saying that you're introverted, I'm also a very introverted person.
Something I noticed too about like sorry, I admire that effort too, which can be super draining, but I noticed that okay, let me start like this. I have heard a lot of people define the word praxis as like a kind of political effort towards change, or maybe a kind of activism. Do you feel like are you using that word because do you feel like your art is an agent for change and I guess to help people, or is that more of like, I don't know, because I personally have no idea what I'm talking, like I don't know what I'm really asking, but I guess I'm saying is like, is that like an intentional like activist effort, do you feel like?
In terms of like my personal activism, I don't define myself as an activist. And this is just my personal definition of activism. I think that I don't want to use that terminology in a way that takes away from individuals who operate in a space of like continuous risk. Because I think that a lot of times, like a lot of people who are working as activists, whose names you might not know, like they are operating in a space of continuous risk, to their lives and to their reputations. So I don't want to sort of frame what I'm doing as activism in that sense, which takes away from like sort of like the realities of activism that exists far outside of celebrity. So that's why I'm like a little trepidatious to that. But
Okay.
when I think about personal activism, when I think about like how do I operate as an individual in the world, how does my artwork in the operate in the world? How does that express like my own politics? How does that encourage people to operate in specific ways and also to think about their own personal politics? That I'm using praxis in that sense because it's like the way in which I perform those politics in my life. Like it's the way in which I perform these like ideologies and these things that I believe in my actual life and in my actual practice as an artist, so that they're beyond just like me saying them.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I think about a lot when I think about what does it look like to democratize education, what does it look like to think about like access to knowledge, what does that look like for like history and you know, art making and all of these things being like sort of like ways in which you can empower people. Like I believe all these things, I think all these things, but I have to think about ways in which I can perform that in the work that I'm doing. So if I'm thinking about like, okay, I believe that Black people should have access to this knowledge and this information, I need to make sure that in the ways that I'm doing it, it's accessible to that community. So I think about like when I'm doing workshops or when I'm teaching, like who is this for and who has access to all of these things? You know, when I'm thinking about my artwork and where it's shown, thinking about who has access to go to those shows, like are there ways in which like people have access to like these images where people have access to me and have access to these ideas? You know, I'm thinking a lot now too about like ways in which we learn, how we have access to information, and thinking about like a lot of the research that I'm doing and like developing like syllabi and reference material and education materials, and how do I make sure that those are accessible and those are free, which I do. So like I have like material that I've created and written and that are free on my website and that I try to encourage people to access and use. And just thinking about like if I'm curating a space, if I'm creating a space, how am I performing those ethics in those spaces, and how are people performing those ethics in that space? How are they embodying, not only performing but embodying those ethics in that space? And I think that's all that I really can do. Like that's the extent of what at this point, and where that's the extent to which at this point in time I'm able to like make change in the world. It's through my practice as an educator, as an artist, as a researcher. This is a way in which I can perform those things. Like I don't like the fact that so much information and so much knowledge is either inaccessible physically or inaccessible just like in terms of like the language to so many people. So what does it look like for me to do work which is accessible to people, that's free for people to access, and which is also easy to understand and also encourages people to think deeply about things? You know, I have an issue with that. How am I performing that activism? How am I performing that in my own work? How am I embodying that in my own work? I have an issue with you know, Black people not having agency over their image and their bodies in media. I don't like the fact that oftentimes like our history and our stories aren't told by us. So how in my artistic practice am I not reenacting that violence? You know, these are things that I think about as an artist. These are things that I think about as a teacher, as an educator. How am I disrupting like power dynamics or respectability politics in my classroom or when I'm working with young people, which is a journey because, like, you know, 20-year-old me probably wasn't thinking about these things. The first group of teens that I was working with, I probably wasn't thinking about those things. No, I wasn't thinking about those things. But how am I working to begin to incorporate those things in my interactions with people as I move forward? You know, that's the way in which I'm thinking about praxis. You know, whether I would define that as like activism, like I don't really know. But I really wouldn't define myself as an activist at this point in time. Again, because of what I spoke about before, like really thinking about, like really interrogating what that really means, and thinking about people who I do consider activists, people who I do think like not only take on that title, but like have really earned that title, and thinking about like what that looks like for them in their lives, and thinking about like how that incorporates space of uncertainty and risk that I want to also respect.
Yeah. Well, something that I noticed too when you're talking about your students or talking about mentors in your community is, or maybe to rephrase this, I feel like we've talked to other people in the past, or I've encountered people in my own experience who, maybe rightly so, this is debatable, but when they speak about students, they don't necessarily talk about them. Like when you're talking about your students and the teenagers that you've taught through Artists for Humanity or people that you've encountered through mass art, you talk about them like equals and talk about how they're also artists, they're also creatives, they're also accomplished. And I feel like a lot of people don't typically regard young people that way. So it's interesting to hear you talk that way because I feel like that has a ripple effect of having a mentor like that or a teacher like that that sees you and sees what you're doing and sees your potential.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's an extension of that philosophy?
I think that's an extension of that philosophy. And also, like, if you talk to anybody who's worked, you know, if you talk to anybody who's worked in this community of people, these are also just amazing people.
Yeah.
Like, these are incredible people. And this is not to diss, like, other people, but, like, these are incredible people, you know? And, like, I'm thinking about it because like you're trying to encourage them to think about themselves as artists who are taking themselves seriously. How are they going to take themselves seriously if you're not taking them seriously?
Yeah.
You know, and I appreciate the fact that you know, older people in my life have taken me seriously and what I want to do seriously. So I have to sort of reciprocate that. But just also being honestly amazed by people's work and also their growth and their potential. And you can't help but be reminded of that when you're working with young people. And that sense of excitement when they're figuring something out. Or like maybe the piece doesn't look that great, but it looks so much better than it did the day before. And just like watching people take themselves seriously as artists, you know. So it's important, you know, that when I'm talking about them, to other people, when I'm talking to them, that I'm taking them seriously as creatives. I'm taking them seriously as artists.
Yeah. I also, this is a little bit of a non sequitur, but to circle back on something that I just realized we didn't get in depth on, you said that you apprenticed in Nigeria. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Of course.
I feel like that's so interesting. Like, where in your trajectory did that happen, and what do you feel like you learned from it?
So, arts organization, this amazing arts organization, which is still in Boston, Arts Connect International, which is an organization very much dedicated to arts equity in the city. They had an international artist in residency program, and I was the second artist to go on to go abroad. And I was at the Nike Center for Art and Culture. It was founded by Chief Nike Ogundaye, who's an amazing artist from Nigeria, legendary artist, Mama Nike. Everybody knows who Mama Nike is in Nigeria. She runs the largest art gallery in West Africa. Oh, wow. And she is not only an amazing personality with an amazing story. She's an Adire artist. She's a traditional weaver. And she also went around Nigeria bringing in all these traditional artists to do workshops. She's represented so many famous artists in Nigeria, very well connected with the artist community in Nigeria. Has just done amazing work. But when I was there, I was in Oshobo, which is like one of the centers for traditional Yoruba religion. It's sacred to the goddess, to the Orisha Oshun. And I was working with people in the traditional religious community there. In addition to learning from master artisans, like I was learning batik there, but I was also learning wood carving from my teacher, Mr. Kunle. So Mr. Kunle Arabumi, who's an amazing carver, originally from Osi, which is another town in Nigeria in Yoruba land. Very patient man that was teaching me wood carving. I was also at Ogidi Jumu, where I was learning weaving and natural dyeing from my teacher, Miss Agnes Umeche, who is an Ibero woman from the town of Okene. And people who study textile arts in Nigeria, traditional Nigerian textiles, will know that Okene is a place for legendary weavers, a center for Ibero weaving, and she's from a family of weavers. They're also an amazing patient teacher. And I was learning there, and I was learning from artists. I was learning from people who were part of the traditional religious community. I was also interacting with just contemporary artists there. And it was an amazing experience. And the thing about Nigeria is, one of the things that I will say, I wish more people knew, if you want to know a space in the world that is like a space that just has a legendary contemporary art scene and just a legendary art history, it's Nigeria. If I had to think about a place in the world that I would think about when I think about art, you know, some people think about Italy, some people think about France. I think about Nigeria. Because not only is there such an amazing contemporary art scene there, but it also has one of the richest and longest art history traditions in the world.
Wow.
3,500 years of art history in Nigeria. And, you know, and seeing how artists are building off of that. Talking to contemporary artists who say, yeah, my grandfather was a traditional carver, or, you know, I learned this work from my grandmother who learned from her grandmother who learned from her grandmother, or, you know, my family were part of like the people who worked, who were part of like the artist guilds for the King of Benin. Like seeing people who are contemporary artists who are part of those lineages as well is incredibly fascinating. And just seeing like just the creative spirit of people there. You know, you'll see young kids who like, they don't have any money, but they have a little bit of naira that they can spend on pen and paper and like teaching themselves how to draw. And it's just like an amazing creative place. West Africa in general is an amazing creative place. Africa in general is an amazing creative place, but Nigeria, that was an experience. Seeing like just like the world of incredibly talented people that are there.
Yeah.
That was an inspiring experience for me.
That must have been so incredible, because I know you mentioned earlier that when you were in school, they weren't even teaching like the history of African art while you were there. Is that correct?
Yeah, they weren't. And you know, it put a lot of things in context, because again, these were all things I had read about in books. It was my first time like actually being there and experiencing things.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like, it was a life-changing experience. My work after coming back from Nigeria, like, it's like night and day. Like it's changed so much and gained so much context from having the experience of being there.
Yeah. Wow, that sounds incredible. And you said that a lot of that work was not just directly influenced the Founders Project, but was literally used in it, some of the weaving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I was there, my original thing was like, I'm going to reproduce like this ancient clothing. So I was working with hand spun cotton and using natural dyes. And it's like, I'm going to recreate like these sort of like ancient textiles and sort of like make a costume, make like a piece of like ceremonial dress. And most of what I was doing, because I was just learning weaving, I only wove 2 pieces when I was there myself. two pieces I turned into, one piece I turned into a bag, one piece ended up in the Founders Project. But I was doing a lot of dyeing, so a lot of like very monotonous processes of like, you know, unspooling like hand spun yarn, you know, transferring it to skeins, learning natural indigo dyeing, using like sorry.
That's okay.
Using like a fermentation process, learning to dye with red sorghum and kola nut, just like learning these like really slow, like long processes. Weaving on the upright loom can be a very slow process, especially using hand spun yarn because it cuts so often, like breaks so often. But just dedicating that time to like that very slow process, and then you know, I brought back all of this fabric that some was woven by me, some was woven by women in Ogidi, and you know, I had this work that I was going to still turn into this costume, but then when I, you know, was selected to be part of the Now and Their Arts Accelerator, I was like, okay, I need to produce all this cloth. I'm not going to have time, and then I ended up using a lot of that for the Founders Project. Yeah, so like it's really interesting that like that work sort of like from, you know, 2016 all the way until 2018, like it was continued. It was physically also a part of the new work doing after I got back from Nigeria.
It's interesting because it seems like there's a through line from when you were very, very young before, like all the way up to now, of just seeking these stories and kind of exploring them deeper and teaching them to others. And I feel like it's really interesting to think about that in when you were talking about your connection to community and your work with young people. And it feels like all of these projects are a continuation of that same exploration. Do you feel like that's an accurate way to look at that?
Yes. I think about that in terms of like my trajectory and like, you know, I'm still interested in the same things, but my understanding and my interests have like evolved. Like the idea is like I'm fine still exploring this thing because it's such a vast like world of things to explore. So long as I'm consistently like in a space of like self-analysis and thinking about like, okay, what are things that I want to learn? Like, how do I want my thinking on this to continue to evolve? Like as I evolve as an artist, so long as the work is moving forward or moving in general.
Yeah.
That's like the important thing for me.
And to change gears a little bit, you know, having, you know, making this like amazing series of work and I guess just this long and detailed project, you know, steps to this project. And is there any sense of like, I know that one of the pieces was picked up by the ICA, which is a huge accomplishment, but is there like, I guess, how does it feel after going through all that work to have this piece and such a beautiful focal point also of the Touching Roots show and like just this single wall center of the room?
I mean, it means a lot. It means a lot. And I think one of the things that really means a lot to me is that like, it's not so much that it's where it is, it's like who it's with. And just being like, I have worked in a gallery with Lois Marion Jones, and also other like textile artists and artists who have been working for years and who have been making amazing work are also shown in that gallery. Ife Franklin, who is an amazing artist from Boston, a Dere artist who's been working in Boston for years. Karen Hampton, who's an amazing like textile artist, was doing incredible work, focusing on like issues of heritage and inheritance and ancestry. Like even just being there with like Napoleon Jones Henderson, who's part of Afro Cobra, and like all of these like amazing people who were part of like this, the making of this project, who are people that I look up to, and just people who have just like really dedicated so much of their lives to exploring these things and really, you know, doing good work. That was something that was incredibly inspiring for me. That was like the big thing for me. I'm incredibly grateful for the Museum of Fine Arts for acquiring one of my pieces.
Congratulations.
So showing that work, that piece, thank you, and then also showing that piece. But I think the biggest thing is that the piece was shown with all of these people that I deeply respect.
Yeah. Are you also the youngest artist in the show?
I don't know. I might. I'm not sure.
Oh, that's awesome. And also,
Go
ahead.
I'm at an age where I'm very much not the youngest anymore. Like, I'm at, like, in school, I'm also teaching, like, 20-year-olds. Like,
Gotcha.
you know, like, I'm 35, so it's like I'm not often in spaces I'm at the youngest person. It's hard to think about myself as, okay, I'm the youngest person in the show. But I think I might be. I'm not completely certain, though.
Right. Also, we totally forgot to ask, but were you also a curator for the show?
Yeah, so I was on the I wasn't a curator, but I was not a curator, but I was on the they had brought together the curatorial team had brought together artists to consult and have conversations about the work, and I was there with, again, some amazing people, Shanoa Baker, Napoleon Jones Henderson, Kara Malika Daniels, amazing, brilliant scholars, and just to also just be there and just to hear them speak and like to hear like their input on things was also really awesome. And just to like be in conversation with them about their work and the things that they're doing was really cool. But I was on that team of people that was contributing and giving feedback about the show.
What was that process like?
It was a really great process. I think what was really great is I feel like people really cared about what we had to say.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also really great to be in a space with people who are like, you know, who are just like really brilliant thinkers and bring up really awesome points. And I think that it's a step in the right direction. I don't always have a lot of faith in museums in general, but like I do think that there are curators and there are people who are like, I don't have faith in the institution, but there are people who are there who I think try to make the spaces as conscious and as ethical as they can, given the resources they have and the power that they have. And I think that this was an instance in which people were really thinking about, okay, we want to create this work thinking about the audience of people who are going to see this work and doing justice to the work and the artists who are shown in this exhibition. I appreciated them for that. I appreciate them taking what we had to say seriously.
Yeah, wow, what a powerful experience. And also one thing we wanted to ask as we close is, you know, you mentioned like there are a lot of people that share that sentiment where they aren't really putting a lot of faith in museums to be accurately representing things or representing things in a holistic and fair way. You know, what do you I guess I'm kind of curious. We've asked this to a few people now involved in the project, but what do you hope that museum goers, whether they're longtime museum heads or people new, you know, coming in for the first time even, like what do you hope they take away from the Touching Roots show?
I think one of the beautiful things about the show is it's really talking about connections between Africans in the America and Africans on the continent. So it's like, even though it's not highlighting African artists that are living on the continent, it's really thinking about how us in the diaspora are looking at the continent of Africa and really thinking about what connections we have with it and what connections we have with that history and that heritage. And I think what I would like people to understand when looking at that is being able to see that connection, be able to see those very palpable relationships that exist between the African past and the Black present in this country. And the reason why I'm hoping that they're able to see that is because that was the intention of a lot of these artists, is they were doing these very intimate explorations into their own ancestry. They were doing these very intimate explorations into understanding who they are through understanding their past. So if museum goers can get a piece of that, then it not only makes the show successful, but it also makes those artists who created that work, who put their energy and they put their spirit into that work, that makes their work successful as well.
Yeah, Stephen, this has been an absolutely wonderful interview. I just want to say how much we appreciate you for coming on here and sharing your your spirit and your story with us on here.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great. It was great talking to all of y'all.
Yeah, so it's been so much fun. We'll keep you updated on when all this stuff's coming out. And once again, thank you. This has been great.
You're very, very welcome. You're very
awesome.
welcome.
And I can't wait to see the show again. I've only got to look at it one time, but I want to go back really soon.
Awesome. It was great talking to you.
All right, great meeting you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
That was artist and arts educator Stephen Hamilton. What a wonderful episode. We learned so much. If you want to learn more about Stephen and his work, visit his Instagram or his website, linked below. Read more about this episode on our blog at bostonartpodcast.com. Thank you guys for listening. Goodbye. Do you like that one?
That was perfect.
Okay, I'll include that take and delete the other ones.
I think that doing the dramatic pauses is fine. That you have to be at parts in your sentence where you want to emphasize a pause. They can't just be in the middle.
Okay, that's completely fair.
Boston Art Podcast is an independent DIY production by Brian Huntress and Theodora Earthworms. The information contained in this episode represents the views and opinions of the original creators or our guests, and does not represent any institution, organization, or business. Find us on Instagram at Boston Art Podcast, and tune in for a new episode every Friday. Thank you for listening.